Hi, Mr. Hart here. Welcome back to Canadian history from World War One till now. Today, we're going to be continuing our study into World War One from the Canadian point of view and looking deeper into Canadian society before World War One so that later on in the course, we can properly assess how World War One changed Canadian society, politics, and our economy. Today's lesson is about women in World War One. In today's lesson, we're going to start by reviewing what we already know about World War One and move on to understanding women's role in Canada between 1914 and 1919, the dates starting and ending World War One. You'll be successful in this lesson if you can identify some of the general trends that demonstrate how women's role in Canada changed during this time period, and you can start to conceptualize how this will impact Canada moving forward after we're finished learning about World War One. Well, let's get into it then, shall we? What do we know so far about women's role in Canada in 1914 and up to that period? Women's role is different then as it is now and different than it was in 1920. Women's role pre-war does not look like it does today. Let's focus on our three channels of understanding: economic, political, and social, to understand and gain a deeper understanding of how women's role changed in this time period. Let's start with the economic role of women before World War One in Canada. The economic role of women in Canada was not very good. In fact, it was quite limited of what women could do. Women were stuck in women's roles, such as teachers, nurses, or low-level administrative support like secretaries. The lower economic income and the inability to make a high living meant a lower political and social status. These things bounce off each other. Women were stuck in these jobs and could not advance to higher paying jobs like doctors, accountants, and lawyers. Moving on to the social role of women before World War One. This looked extremely difficult then as it does now. Before World War One, women were mostly put into the domestic sphere of public life. This meant staying in the household and performing household duties like cleaning, cooking, and raising children. Women were mostly seen as wives, daughters, and mothers, and not really seen as independent from men. They were reliant on men and not very visible in public areas such as in society, art, and culture in Canada. Our last channel, politically, the political status of women was also severely limiting. There was no suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. Women were not allowed to vote in Canadian elections before World War One, and World War One had a lot to do with this development. That means women could not run for office and didn't hold positions of power. According to Canadian law, women were not persons and therefore unable to have suffrage and vote in elections. Now we finished our review and have a better understanding of the women's role in Canada before 1914. World War One changed women's role dramatically. And one of the ways that we're going to understand this is by looking at primary sources, sources that are created at the time that they're talking about to understand the time period. Specifically, I'm talking about propaganda posters. Today, specifically, war bonds. Remember what war bonds means from your vocabulary. War bonds were a program instituted by the country, by Canada, to get people to loan money to the government to pay for the war. Remember, wars can be quite expensive. That's why even women who did not possess a lot of money were encouraged to join the war effort by putting what little money they had towards the Canadian war bond program. Right here on the screen is a very good example of a Canadian war bond campaign poster aimed at including women in the Canadian war effort. It says, "Attack on all fronts," meaning that there is the war front, the actual fighting in Europe that was going on, and the home front, whatever women who would be staying home and not fighting on the front lines could be doing to support the war. You see that the two men have weapons and ammunition, two things very necessary in order to defeat the Germans, but the woman has a hoe used for gardening. Women were very important to farming and providing food for men on the front lines. This is an example of how we can tell women were included and the role was changed during World War I. For today's homework that you'll be doing independently, today we're going to be looking at propaganda posters on your own, but for now, let's analyze a couple more. The first one on the left, for a healthy, happy job, join the Women's Land Army. What do you think this means? I think that it means that women were encouraged to take jobs that were not historically occupied by women, such as working on farms using their manual labor in order to create food. This is an example of how women's role changed. Let's look at the one on the right. We're in the army now. Your aid is vital. Save metals, bags, paper, bones, rubber, glass. They are used in war supplies. Get in touch with your local committee. What is the poster trying to say to women who are viewing the poster? Well, for example, we are encouraging women who usually work in the domestic area at home to save things like metal and glass so that could be used to create weapons and other war supplies to help the boys overseas fight the Germans. As we can see, women's roles changed dramatically in light of World War I in Canada. Men signed up, women stepped in. They stepped in to run the family farm and the business, growing food, moving food, creating supplies, delivering materials for supplies in order to help the war effort over in Europe. Women were not in combat roles, but their effort was vital to winning World War I. Sounds like a good thing, right? Well, unfortunately, many women found themselves doing the same job that the men were doing prior to the war for a fraction of the pay. Not as much money, actually quite less. And this was a big change economically and politically for women. Women did not want to tolerate these circumstances anymore, based on the basic principle of fairness. Thinking back to the course's major historical thinking concept, cause and consequence, we're going to be spending the rest of the lesson looking into the consequences of women's changing role in World War I. Remember to think about your channels politically, socially, and economically, and try to understand how these roles changed in light of the changing factors of women's labor and participation in the home front. Your assignment is on D2L, and I look forward to reading your responses. Thank you.